That's a very subtle way to start, isn't it? I can see that many of these TED speeches stir emotions. I don't think this will. This is about emotions. There's a question about 5 meters above my head. By the way, sorry if I'm scratching once in a while. I just grew a beard, and I decided I couldn't grow any taller, so I grew a beard. But I'm going to try to answer this question in the coming 15 minutes or so. And first of all, music gives us humans more than any other language could possibly give. And everybody understands it, regardless of race, culture, taste in clothing, or background, education. You know, everyone gets it. And it's also biologically genetic. Mothers sing to their babies because that's the first language we understand. I know I have 3 babies, and I know their mother. So, and it's also a symbolic system. I don't want to get too deep here, but music is a symbolic system, far more powerful and efficient than any numbers or words that are out there. So, assuming that the greatest challenge of all in communication is to make people have expectations, then 4 new challenges arrive. And those 4 challenges are continuity, and then number 2 is element of surprise, number 3 is mystique, or to leave people with a thought, and number 4 is your emotions. So, and to understand this question above my head, we're going to spend a little time on the brain here. Right in the back of our necks is where we have our visual input. Now, 2 very important things about visual in general is that number 1, visual, how we consume things visually is a very active way. We read the newspaper in an active way. We watch television in an active way. I'm looking at you right now actively. So what happens with an active sense when you use it is that you decipher that information in quite a rational, intellectual way. Now, as it is active, we've only been given like 1 or 2 seconds filter to decide whether we're going to keep that information that we see or not in the visual memory. Let's jump right to the front of our head, which is the prefrontal cortex, is where all the planning takes place. It's where you're actually deciding right now maybe if what you hear now is interesting or not. That happens right here. And all our emotions happen in our prefrontal cortex. So if you haven't touched people here in the prefrontal cortex, you haven't done anything. Continuing, then right in the middle of our brain is basically between our ears is sound input. Right there is where we take in sound. And sound is kind of different from sight in the way that it's a passive sense. You can hear things when you're not listening, but you can't see things when you're not looking. So sound is a passive sense, and it appeals to our emotions. Sight appeals to our intellect. So moving on even further, we put all the information from this passive sense into our auditory memory, which is the yellow part of the brain that you can see there. It's one of the biggest parts of the brain. This is where we keep 11 to 1200 melodies and songs in this hard drive called the auditory memory. Moving on, there's maybe the most important part in the brain in terms of communication is Broca. Broca does 3 things. Number 1, it creates verbs. It gives sound to what we do. Number 2, it creates sentences at the speed of light. So we think, and then sentences come out of our mouth. And number 3, the most important thing, it predicts. And people hate predictability. We hate it so much that you can actually use predictability as torture. dripping water is a kind of, torture in terms of predictability. So people want to be surprised. And the element of surprise is actually like oxygen to communication. I'm going to give you an example of that later. But keeping this in mind now, the difference between sound and sight here, I want to show you an example. It's a TV spot, advertising commercial, and I'm going to show it to you, part of it, without the sound. Now you're taking this in a rational way. You are not using many emotions right now. Let's try this advertising spot with sound.
I am a growing force without the motion. A glass of water longing for the ocean. I am a fire burning desperately, but you're controlling me.
Introducing biopower from Saab.
Something happens, doesn't it? Because sound, and music in particular, is that little symbolic bridge between what we don't know and what we know. All forms of art are symbolic bridges. Poetry, paintings are symbolic bridges to explain something that we don't know into actually knowing it. And music is maybe the most powerful. You have your left brain, and then there's the right brain, and then there's that symbolic bridge. I'm going to take you on a journey now from the left brain, the rational part of the brain, to the unpredictable, so to speak, part of the brain, the right brain. I'm going to take you on that journey. I'm going to repeat a sentence I said. The very first sentence I said today was, music gives humans more than any other language can give. Let me say that again. Music gives us humans more than any other language can possibly give. Now I'm just going to say a piece of that sentence now, and I'm going to turn it into music, because you're still interpreting me with your left brain. More than any. 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 You just took a journey from your left brain to your right brain. And I touched your emotions not until I reached your right brain, which is why music is so powerful. So, you could say that music is a continuous emotional element of surprise that leaves you thinking and feeling. This means that the answer to the challenge of great communication is in music. 8 out of 10 advertising executives today think that music is the second most powerful tool they have. Yet only 5% of the advertising budgets are being skewed that way. This is something about to happen. And the beautiful thing about music is that it works regardless of platform. It can work on television, online, on radio, maybe not in newspapers, but that's their problem. I think somebody already spoke about that today. So, music is the first, maybe the first complex form of communication, and paradoxically enough, it's also the most up-to-date. And think about it. What's the alternative? If artists and painters can call themselves makers of advertising, then why shouldn't songwriters and pop singers do the same? The answer like for most things, is rock and roll.